This is Cornelia Harris Banks, and we are getting ready to work on part two of the history of Galveston in reference to Juneteenth. Uh, Faye, do you know that there are many things that we can discuss when in relationship to Juneteenth? Um, I have some items, and I see you have some, and I want to go back and just talk about the fact that there were your concept paper that talked about Juneteenth. One was the Emancipation Celebration in the Early Years of Freedom, and that was from 1865 to 1900. And you received copies and articles from that time. The other is the celebration continued from 1900 to 1950, which talked about the black migration to the cities from rural areas, many people returning home from rural areas to celebrate Juneteenth with family members remaining in the county. Then we had the celebration through decades from 1950 to present. And I know you and I and others attended one of the oldest schools, African American schools in the state of Texas. In fact, it was the first for African American. You in the 50s and I in the 60s. And so, you want to talk about?
Yes, well, I tell my colleagues now in Indiana, where I now live, that I had a wonderful and beautiful childhood in Galveston, Texas, because celebrating black achievement and black excellence was always a part of the mix. And Juneteenth was and is the cornerstone of the celebration, which starts with emancipation. We were always aware that something very special happened on June 19th, 1865, when the Civil War was ending and Abraham Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation sometimes earlier, but was ignored because 11 of the states had formed a whole new country called the Confederacy. And those 11 states went to war against what we call the Civil War now, war between the states. And some of us call it the lost cause because they did not win. And at the beginning of the Civil War, there were 31 states. Half of those states were slave states and half were free. At the end of the Civil War in 1865, all illegal slavery, or slavery was illegal in all of the country, and the 13th Amendment was already introduced, which then, once that amendment was adopted, the 13th Amendment, and in Galveston, we celebrated the 13th Amendment as the cornerstone when slavery really became illegal in the country. It was an idea and which the Civil War was fought about, and now there were people trying to tell us that the Civil War has nothing to do with slavery. Well, I urge them to go back to their history books and look at the acts of the legislature in those 11 states that started the Confederacy. It's called the Articles of Succession. And each of those states, their legislature adopted the articles which said that they were separating from the United States and forming their own country. And it was called the Confederacy. And it did not last very long. The Civil War lasted from 1861 to 1865, and each of those states ended up being readmitted to the Union by 1870. But it was a process, not a one act, that each of those legislatures had to agree that they would live by the 13th Amendment. And of course, the 14th and 15th Amendment came along. So we say we are a nation of laws and not of men. Well, there is enough documentation that can show that not only is that true, because there were 3 of the amendments to the Constitution, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, which legalize the citizenship of the newly freed slaves and gave them the right to vote. The 13th Amendment ended slavery. The 14th Amendment was the first definition of citizenship. And the 15th Amendment, of course, was the right to vote. And they were all passed during the Reconstruction period. And that is called the Reconstruction period, which came at the end of Civil War because we were rebuilding and reuniting the country. Galveston was an important part of that because the port of Galveston became an international port during that period. And one can go down to the wharves in Galveston now and find records that began in 1837 when there were a number of slave ships arriving until now. We are now a port where leisure people come to go to the Caribbean and South America from the Port of Galveston. So the Port of Galveston, while changing its function, first the cargo was people, then it was cotton, and now it's people seeking pleasures throughout the world.
Well, it sounds an exciting place to come, so that's why we want folk to come and visit Galveston Island, Texas.
Yes, and one can see a lot of events, places which have great historical significance. One of the things that I like to do in Galveston is go to the East End, where there's a young African-American man whose father and mother were in school with me, who has made carvings out of the trees of people. One of the carvings in around Galveston that Earl Jones, is his name, has made is of Jack Johnson, who was the first black heavyweight champion. He is a BOI. And there is this statue of Jack Johnson, which would be on display, and learning more about him was important. There are people who have feelings about visiting graveyards, but one of the other things, one of the first presidential appointments was a African American, again a mulatto, called Norris Wright Cuney. The people of Galveston, black people of Galveston, got together. His grave was basically unmarked. There is now a statue of a man standing tall in the graveyard in Galveston, which commemorated Norris Wright Cuney, and he was appointed the collector of customs at the port of Galveston. Now, can you imagine at that time to have that kind of appointment that he was collecting when Galveston was an important port and a gateway to the West, that for him to be the head of collector of customs, and as part of my research I've learned the man who appointed him was President Benjamin Harrison, who happens to be from Indiana.
Oh,
And the presidential home in Indianapolis has now events where they commemorate it, because not only did Benjamin Harrison appoint Norris Wright Cuney collector of customs, he appointed Frederick Douglass to be minister to Haiti. So when you look at all of the connections that we have always been a part of, the history of the area, and Galveston has been a very important economic and political social part of it, the growth and development. And as I said, when I was growing up, we talked about the gateway to the West, because at the beginning of the war, there was no way to get to the other parts of the country, which were not yet states. After Texas, there was California. Now there's Oklahoma, New Mexico, Colorado, all of which were territories then, not states. So if we start looking and doing, and I request that people start looking up their own history, that they can be able to find some amazing people in their own families whose survival and contributions to the growth of this island and the country was very important. The black longshoremen, or the cotton jammers as we knew them, they are pioneers in organized labor. And most of us who were of a certain age in Galveston grew up where all of our activities on the waterfront, the beachfront, was at 29th Street. Well, when I look up the history of 29th Street, it was the longshoremen who bought that land first off and then resold it to black entrepreneurs. The retired longshoremen, when I was growing up, ran what they had a bathroom. The only place a black person could rent a swimming suit was from the bathhouse at the corner of 28th and Seawall Boulevard, which was operated by retired longshoremen. Again, when you think about people not having pensions, but that's the way they survived. And they managed their union hall in a way that my first speaking engagements was at the ILA hall, because that was the way we lived and worked together and developed our kids' talents. There was a program there of some people. Almost every child I knew took music lessons or dance lessons, and their recitals were at the ILA hall.
You know, what is that saying that we generally say about doing Juneteenth?
We say, come on home where it all began.
Come on home where it all began.
And everybody can find something.
Or someone
will attach them to the history of African American contributions and African American exceptionalism. on the island.
Growing up and celebrating Juneteenth, of course, one of the things that we always were able to put together for the celebration would be barbecue and Big Red soda water and watermelon. And I'm sure everybody has some addition that they added
One of
to
the
that.
interesting stories about watermelon, 2 years ago, a the Children's Museum who was celebrating Juneteenth, and this man put together something they called the watermelon salad, and it created some confusion. And I reminded them that they don't understand Juneteenth traditions, that they saw the caricatures and the making fun of black people eating watermelon. But the idea is that it was red, and red was a celebratory color.
Yes.
So if you put the barbecue, the red soda water, and the watermelon together, you understand the spirit of Juneteenth being red as a celebratory color.
I know after I finished high school, I was going to college, and I was going to college in California, in Los Angeles, in fact. And the 19th of June rolled around, my first summer there in Los Angeles, and no one, not anyone, now this was the early 60s, and no one was celebrating. And I called home and I said, have these black folks lost their mind? And that was really when I found out it was just a Texas holiday. And so I tell you, it's wonderful that we know now that many people in many states are celebrating. And so, but we want everybody to come
Well, see,
to
you were in
Galveston.
Southern California.
Yes.
Most of my folks were in Northern California.
Yes.
And one of the earlier celebrations that I attended as a young adult was in San Francisco.
Really?
And there was a place called the Texas Playhouse on Fillmore
Yeah.
Street. And that's where all the Texans gathered. And then the celebration got so big, years later, they moved it to the Masonic Temple in Oakland.
Now, I did attend that event myself.
Okay.
Once I went to Northern California. In fact, I learned from a family member, my dad's brother, who moved to Oakland. They went from Todd Shipyard, that was in Galveston docks, where our
That's right.
longshoremen and people who worked there, and they went to Oakland, California. The majority of Galvestonians.
Yeah, because San Francisco has what I call a very southern edge to its cultural experiences there. And it is because the major employer in the San Francisco area was the waterfront. So the blacks who moved from this part of the country could easily transfer their work and their membership. And in fact, the national ILA office is in San Francisco.
Wow.
I've written there several times as I've been helping people look up their work history through
Right.
ILA.
Well, I'm hoping again that those persons who see this podcast realize how important Galveston, Texas, or Galveston Island, Texas, has been important to the African American community. Period.
Yep, in the whole country, not
the
just
country,
because
yes.
of the things that began
Yes.
and the southern migration, as I know it. When I meet people, no matter where in the country they grew up, they will usually have some kind of Texas and Galveston connection. Either they worked in the shipyards, they recognize the major transportation, we have to understand, was by boat. So when you were shipping something in the early days, it went by boat, not an airplane. And who was loading those boats?
African Americans.
And as I said, they were one of the first unionized people in the African American community.
I was talking with someone earlier, and they reminded me that every one of the predominantly uh, denominations in the churches were first in Galveston, Texas.
Yeah.
The first Baptist church, the first
But
Methodist.
yeah,
The
a lot
first,
of them, several of them I
Catholic.
know, started as slave churches
Yes.
because the blacks who went to those churches were the slaves of
The church, yes.
the owners of the church. And one of the stories that I know about is the split from Reedy to St. Paul
Yes.
Methodist Church, because once they were emancipated, the white congregation would not transfer the title of ownership to the black congregation.
That's correct.
And then people went down the street and bought some land and built St. Paul.
Yes, that is true. That is true.
So when we look at the struggles and historically, it is quite easy to understand the times in which those things were happening and the special talent, contributions, and patience that it took for those individuals to be able to accomplish. The fact that the earlier voting rights cases, the fact that the longshoremen got a holiday built into their contracts early on, the first black high school, public high school, was all on Galveston Island. And some remnants of each of those earlier institutions still exist and celebrate their beginnings and their history.
I think the same thing with the Catholic. They
Yeah,
had the
that's
first,
right. Holy Rosary was the first black Catholic congregation in the state. They celebrated their centennial in 1988, because I came to it because my mother's family all went to Holy Rosary High School. My mother, I proudly say, was a valedictorian of the 1932 graduating class at Holy Rosary High School. And her sister graduated in 1939, which was the year they closed the high school. So the fact that Galveston once had two black high schools is a very important landmark, and that seeing a black nun at that time, and the Holy Family Nuns, which was headquartered in New Orleans. There are two Black Order nuns founded in this country. The Oblate in Baltimore and the Holy Family people out of New Orleans.
wow.
And there are people in Galveston alive today who went to Holy Rosary and remember those nuns.
I do.
Yes.
I remember the
Because
later
black
ones.
nuns were non-existent or a rarity in most of the world, and the fact that they had enough to populate a school here as well as there was a school in Houston.
In fact, one experience I had was that when I went to Holy Rosary, and at that time it was just only went to the sixth grade.
Mm-hmm.
And when you left Holy Rosary in the sixth grade, you then either went to a Catholic school somewhere else in San Antonio or in Louisiana.
Yeah. Holy Rosary Institute.
Yes. And then you could come back to Galveston to then at that time to a junior high school and then on to Central. And so, that talks about some of the issues that are, now. I remember again, it just made me think hearing you talk about that when I was in college in Southern California. And I went to a college party, and there was a huge Confederate flag. I backed out of that party so fast because for me, here in being raised in Galveston, Texas, or in Texas, the Confederate flag meant something very bad. I remember the parades that we were in going down the seawall where there were folk who had those Confederate flags as well as dogs and all kinds of things. But, you know, all in all, as you said previously, being raised in Galveston was a good thing. We had a wonderful time.
Well, we had pride in ourselves and each other.
Yes.
And that was something when I first moved to Indiana, which did not celebrate anything blackness. And in fact, several of the schools which had black names did not, for example, the Booker T. Washington and Carver Elementary School did not even have a picture of those two men on their walls.
Well, and we did here in Galveston.
Yes, I went to Booker T. and Carver for a bit. And the sense of belonging, I think, is what is different. And I tell a lot of my friends, well, how could you be segregated and still have a sense of belonging? I said, because I didn't know I needed white people. And that makes a big difference when you feel needy.
You know, and I'm not laughing because that sounds funny. I'm laughing because when I went to college, mm-hmm. I did not know one white person my age from Galveston, Texas. And it was that realization that I didn't miss it.
I had everything I needed. I had my beach, my school, my recreation center, and I could go down to the country in Brazoria to my father's home place and pick fruit out of the garden, and I could go there for the homecoming. But that whole sense of belonging to something bigger than yourself, I think, is what too many of our kids are missing. And I hope that by your efforts, Cornelia, and your group, that we can start instilling more of the pride of our history and not be identified only as what's on television today.
We have documents with us that we're going to discuss and show to you as soon as we come back from our break. We're back, and thank you for staying with us as we continue to discuss our documents. Fay, which one would you like to
Well,
start?
I like to start with what I call the origins of Juneteenth. This is the thing that got it all started on June 19th, 1865, when the Union Army, under the leadership of Gordon Granger, and I would like to read to you the importance of the date that we celebrated as Juneteenth. That this says, Headquarters, District of Texas, Galveston, Texas, June 19th, 1865, General Orders Number 3. Says, the people are informed that in accordance with the proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. But this is the clause that gave me goosebumps at first, is that this involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor. Now, that's when you really know you're free. It means that you can be paid for your work. And that with absolute equality. But those are the clauses in General Order 3 that, to me, makes emancipation a reality. The other thing, but there are 5 orders. And it's very important also that we understand that first they had to take charge and put in a command force. And in doing that, they had to declare that the Confederacy was no longer in order. That's General Order 4. So after they freed the slaves, put in a command order, it says, all acts of the governor and legislators of Texas since the ordinance of succession, I here declare illegitimate. All civil and military officers and agents of the so-called Confederate States of the state of Texas and all persons formerly connected with the Confederate Army of Texas will at once report for parole in the following places. So they moved from being in charge of government to being prisoners and having to report. And I think we need to spend more time looking at all of the things which were put in place on June 19th by the Union Army. Of course, General Order 3 was the most significant because it says that slaves are free, but saying that nothing the Confederacy did counted is, to me, also extremely important.
So we actually need to know all 5 of the orders.
Yes. We need to remind them that they lost, because too much of our response to the Confederate issues is it's as though they won something. They lost the war and they lost the right to own people, which was the basis of their economy. Mississippi went from being a very rich state to a very poor state because the wealth was in slaves.
It's another one of your documents.
The other thing that I have, what I like to refer to, is the order, the making it a national holiday. I never dreamed that I would live long enough to see Juneteenth become a national holiday. Some of the states had already adopted it, but the fact that it would pass through Congress but on February 25th, 2021, Bill H.R. 1320 was passed, which makes, it says, to amend Title V United States Code to establish Juneteenth Independence Day as a federal holiday. That piece of legislation, and the major sponsor, which there was a long list of congresspersons, but Sheila Jackson Lee was the leading sponsor of this bill that established the national holiday. But of course, Texas had made it a state holiday by, I'm embarrassed, the name of Edwards?
No.
Who?
Al Edwards.
Al Edwards, yes, somehow. And he went to Texas Southern at the same time with me. Yeah, okay. And he was the person who introduced the legislation. But the one thing that we also have to look at about it, to me, it's the statesmanship which he established, because the same bill that makes Juneteenth a holiday in Texas also makes a January date Confederate Heroes Day. But to me, that's an act of diplomacy when you can put those two things in the same bill under the leadership of a black man. It says, no, we forgive you because you lost. But we're willing to acknowledge that there were some people who were fighting that you respect.
And those are very two important documents that really show authentically that it became a state holiday and then the national holiday.
Yes. And
The only thing
it
that
can
I-
only get bigger and better.
Right.
As we commemorated, look up our own history as it relates to our family, and celebrate our contributions to this country, and to show how we have moved from being property and cargo to being full-fledged citizens. However, we're still working for that absolute equality. But I liked those words, that we are busy about trying to find absolute equality. And Juneteenth helps us celebrate the progress that we have made over the years.
Again, say our little slogan.
Oh, yeah. So I say to all my former BOIs and all other people who've been part of the migration is, come on home where it all began. And Galveston is the place if you want to celebrate freedom and equality.
Fay, do you remember early you talked about the newspaper and you talked about the Galveston Daily News, but there were papers that were
Galveston is one of the places that earlier had a black newspaper. The City Times
Here it
was
is.
one of those. When I was growing up, there was a man named John McGaffey, and he published something then called, this was in the 40s, and he published something called the Galveston Voice. And there are copies of the Galveston Voice at the Texas History Center downtown. But it was the first place that I read. My father subscribed to it, and they reported on events important to the black community that you couldn't read in the Galveston Daily News. So having a newspaper was extremely important to the community in terms of getting the word out about what was going on civically. But the City Times, the Galveston Voice, and there were several others which were important, two publications in the state. And as I said, but the Galveston Daily News tended to have a more open policy for reporting news of the African American community. And as I said, I can go through all of their archives and find Juneteenth celebrations from 1866 through today.
Great. So again, I just want to continue telling folks to come on down, come to Galveston, to the authentic place where Juneteenth began. Thank you.